here. And now we know. That was the first time that's happened, actually, that it announced that. All right, so welcome everyone. This is the last workshop of an 8-part series. There have been some amazing presenters and instructors so far, and I'm honored to finish it off, and I'm also very excited to finish it off with one of my favorite ferments, wild fermented soda. Little pitch for those who are in Pittsburgh, I'm doing a soda CSA, and what I'll be talking about tonight is kind of the stuff I'm going to be making for my CSA. And essentially, I'm going to be talking about the very basics of making wild fermented soda, how to utilize your local resources, your wild yeast, any scraps you have around in your kitchen. This is aimed to inspire and to encourage you, and also just to break it down so that you know the very simple practices of making these wild fermented beverages. And I'm going to be doing a little demo in the middle, and I sent out an email saying what you would need if you wanted to participate. I just wanted to get a sense, is anyone going to be participating? Okay, Hannah and Trey, cool. All right, good to know. So
yeah, spare time.
Awesome. So essentially, I'm going to talk a little bit about wild fermentation, about like the scraps and resources that we have around us, go into the soda demo. I'll display what I have in my kitchen right now, what I've got brewing, and then go into carbonation. And then I'll just talk about, you know, what has inspired me, what people have great books out there, and how to connect with, you know, other fermentation people in your local community, because I think a lot of this is about community building, not only with the microbes, but also about those who inspire you around you. And before we even begin, it's important to talk about fermentation broadly. So fermentation is the transformative process of microorganisms. Today, we're mainly talking about yeast. So we're talking about the wild yeast that exists on the plant material we're going to be using, or really anything else. So for instance, if you're using fruit, you're going to have some wild yeast on that fruit, in and around that fruit, and you're going to be utilizing those wild yeast in order to make your carbonated beverage. You could also get your wild yeast from flowers, from really any like plant material that you forage, and there are some plant materials that are more ideal than others, but I've really had success with so many random things, including, you know, like today I'm going to be using apple cores, because that's often a scrap that you have left over after slicing into some apples, and that is a great opportunity to turn into something delicious. Also, I wanted to mention, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions throughout this. I'll be looking at the chat box, but it might be a lot easier for me to just answer if you want to unmute. No worries if you can't or don't want to. I'll also just make sure I look at the chat box too. So also, whenever I hear wild yeast, I think of vast plains with herds of free-running yeast colonies. That's from Colin. I love that. That's really cool. And I like the different metaphors that people think of, and really any image when it comes to yeast, running yeast colonies. I love that phrase. All right, so within wild fermentation, we can utilize the yeast, as I was talking about, in order to create something bubbly. And really what that entails is feeding that yeast some sugar. So there's some sugar, for example, if we're using fruit, there's some sugar within that fruit, and those yeast will slowly break down the fruit, and it has some sugar to digest, but if it has more sugar, it can create an even more bubbly concoction when you start adding liquid. And you can utilize those bubbles to create carbonation, your CO2. So you'll have small amounts of alcohol coming out of that and CO2. And if you close your container that you're fermenting, then you will have carbonation that is stored in that vessel. And I'll go into, you know, different containers that you can use for this process and whatnot. But it's very basic. So today, all we're really using is some sort of yeast form, some sort of object that is edible, that has yeast on it, some sugar, and some water. and then you have your different vessels. When it comes to the different types of scraps you have around your kitchen, it's really free for all. It's really anything that you feel like could be flavorful, and also something that has some sort of yeast on it. So again, fruit are ideal. Today I'm going to be using some dry lemon balm. Now I don't think necessarily of like my dry lemon balm is full of yeast. It's actually really old. You know, there's probably some bacteria and yeast on there, but it's not the most ideal thing to utilize, in my opinion, for trying to harvest some yeast and to get something that's really bubbly. That's really going to be coming from maybe some fresh flowers, or even like pine cones, things you can find in the wild, and then your fruit. So today, back up, my day job is working at a co-op grocery store. I'm a cheese buyer. That also means I get access to a lot of fruit that is like inedible. Really, it just doesn't look that great for the customer. And that means that I can walk home with a lot of, bruised apples, nectarines, peaches. Berry season is great because there are so many berries that mold very quickly. And so what I have today are just some apple cores from some apples that I just sliced into. And then I have a small little peach that it's bruised. It doesn't look that great. And I'm just going to be utilizing the yeast on here and also the flavor. Again, I also mentioned the lemon balm. So I'm going to be using some of this old dried lemon balm as flavoring. And it's going to be a cold steeping process. And there are various ways of approaching this, and I'll talk about those different ways. But I'm going to start with just a very simple, like cold steeping method, in which we're just going to be pouring water over top of these different scraps. So I'm going to start off. For those who are following me with this demo, feel free to grab whatever you're using, whatever scraps you decided to use. Actually, I'm curious what you're using today, Hannah and Trey.
We have some blackberries and raspberries, and I don't know if those should go together or if we should just solo in on one, and mint.
Yeah, I mean, they would be great together, but also, if you want to try them out separately to compare, that could be cool too. You can't really go wrong. And so when you have any fruit you want to use, one question would be, do you want it to taste like the fruit? Do you want it to be like a blackberry flavored? Or do you want it to be like an essence of blackberry? You don't need a whole lot of fruit. I think in my email, I said 1/4 cup to 1/2 cup of fruit. You could use up to 1 pound really, but 3 berries is enough to inoculate your concoction with the wild yeast that are there. So I'm gonna switch my video just so you can see. I'm really just gonna chop some fruit, but why not get a spotlight view? That.
If you're using a small fruit like berries, is it differ in how you would chop it from like a core of an apple?
So that's a good question. Yeah, you could what I would do is squeeze it with my hands and just mash it to try to get as much flavor out of that. Again, like if you wanted to be like, I want to do some blackberry essence, you could just throw those in there. But honestly, I feel like you're missing out on so much flavor from that. I'm trying to spotlight my video, but for some reason, I'm not seeing it. Are you all seeing it? I just see like a blank screen. Oh, it disappeared.
No, we still see you.
Oh. Let me try this again. Oh my gosh. My iPhone is too hot right now. So it shut off. Okay. We don't need the spotlight view. I'm just going to chop these. So I've met my apple cores. And what I'm going to do is just chop them into smaller pieces. There was still like a decent amount of apple on here. And I'm exposing the yeast to more surface area. And I'm also just getting more flavor out of this. So it doesn't really matter. I just did like a rough chop. And then I have my vessel. Anything that will hold a quart is good for this. I'll talk about different methods you can do after I do this. I would call this like a single batch method, in that you throw all of the material you need all at once, and you don't need to change the volume. as in you don't need to add more water or dilute it or take away any water.
Now, when you're doing this, are there like parts of the fruit that you wouldn't use? Like I'm about to use some strawberries, for example. Would you get rid of the greens on top? Do they add bitterness? Like, do you have any experience with that?
You could throw in the greens. Actually, one of the other instructors was talking about utilizing those like raspberry greens and the little, tidbits and skin from strawberries and turning that into a ferment in itself. So, yeah, I mean, you could throw it in there. You could also put it aside. I honestly don't feel like you're going to get much specific flavor from it, especially if you're just doing like a cold steep. Yeah. Also, I know Soiree has a lot of experience. So Soiree, if you have any specific thoughts throughout this, feel free to chime in too. Got other experienced fermenters in the room.
I usually use it all. If the fruit isn't particularly ripe, the top of the strawberry isn't going to add anything. It's not like wonderful flavor it's going to add. It may make you feel less guilty, but I don't know that it's going to add much flavor.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah.
But I use it all. Skins are particularly potent flavor additives for all sorts of ferments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and that's another thing about this process is because it's so simple and easy, it's something you could do very quickly. Let's say you have 5 minutes and you just harvested some strawberries or you got them from who knows where. You just chop them up quickly, squeeze them, throw them in a container with some sugar, cover it, and then you can go do your thing and come back to it. But it doesn't need that much attention in the beginning. All right, so.
Quick question with skins. When you said that those are good for fermenting, would like clementines or something like that, would you actually use like, how would you approach that? Like mash up the fruit itself and keep the skin, or what would you do with that?
You could definitely use the skin on clementines. I actually have one that I'm going to show you where I just threw in the whole peel, but you will get some of that bitterness, from the inside of the peel. You could just zest the whole thing if you wanted to, but if you don't mind that subtle bitterness, you could throw it in. You could leave it in there the whole time, or you could just put it in there for a little bit to get some of that flavor. All right, so I have my apples, I have my small little peach, and it's just chopped up, small pieces. And then I'm also going to take some of my dried lemon balm. This is from last year, and I'm about to get a bunch more of fresh lemon balm that I'm excited to use fresh. And I want to start getting rid of some of the dried herbs I have from last year. So I'm just taking a handful, this much. If I was doing product development, I would be weighing everything. But I'm just going to crush it up, expose some of those essential oils. Break down some of that flavor, and there we go. So I have my herb, I have my fruit, and you could really use, any herb would do. Anything you would want to eat in this instance, even like herbs that you think of as being more savory. I'm just gonna wash my hands real quick. So the general ratio that I use for sugar is roughly 4 tablespoons or a quarter cup per quart. Now, I generally like it less sweet, so I like to start with 3 tablespoons. Also, if you're using fruit and it has a lot of sugar, consider that as being a sweetener in and of itself. So there's not that much sweetness that's going to come from this, but a small amount, where I'm just going to start at the shorter end of that ratio. So I say 3 to 4 tablespoons per quart. There we go. So I'm using cane sugar. You can use honey, maple syrup, really any sugar that has actual sugars in it. You don't want to use alcohol-based sugars, non-carb-based sugars. You could use a little bit of molasses. Cane sugar is great because it's more of a neutral flavor. So if you're trying to really extract the flavor coming from the materials you're using, then it doesn't counteract that in any way. I like to use maple syrup when I can, even though it's expensive, just because it's kind of the local sugar of my landscape. So if I'm really trying to like harvest or forage any ingredients from my local landscape, I like to highlight the sugar that's also coming from there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I have my 3 tablespoons of sugar in here. Now I'm just going to add a quart of water. And you want to use non-chlorinated water. I just have some filtered water. Luckily, where I get my water from is not super chlorinated. Do whatever you need to do to remove the chlorine if you have a lot of chlorine in your water. You know, one hopes that the water that we drink is not going to be full of crap, but a lot of the water around this country is not very safe. So, you know,
I have a question.
What's that?
Yeah, this is Thomas. I was wondering, like, what are your best practices for removing chlorine or chloramine from city water?
Yeah, so luckily I haven't had to go through that process very much. So I filter, and I just have a basic like per filter. Also, if you let it sit out for 24 hours, that will have some of the chlorine dissolve over time. Although some of the chloramine will bind to the water more, or it's potentially stuck in that water. So boiling, filtering, letting it sit overnight, those are all ways of removing that. Again, you want it to be to the point where you don't have too much chlorine or chloramine in the water and that it will inhibit fermentation. But you also don't want to be drinking that water anyways. If you have pretty bad water and you don't drink it, then it's probably not good for fermentation. That being said, I've also used water that I probably shouldn't have been drinking, and it's made a wild fermented beverage. So it's kind of up to your comfort level, but you can have a sluggish ferment if your water isn't completely chlorine free, not completely, but like mostly chlorine free.
Okay, yeah, I knew that the issue, you know, with chlorine, you know, letting it, you know, just air dry, let's say, and then chloramine is a bit trickier, you know, which is what I struggle with.
Yeah.
So thanks for that insight. And can I say, where are you getting your water, man?
Well, I am using tap water. I filter my tap water, and
okay.
Yeah, and it's fine. So I live in, yeah, you're the couple in Highland Park, right?
Yeah, we're in West Mifflin. Yep. So we're Pennsylvania American water.
Yeah.
When we were in San Diego, other than when I bought spring water when I was in commercial production, I used the Berkey, and the Berkey post filters do a decent job of helping with the chloramines and the fluoride.
Okay.
So something to consider there. And we don't want our distilled water either. So we don't want to go all the way the other way.
Oh.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've heard that.
I've heard those minerals.
Thank you.
Great. I appreciate you taking the time to answer that.
Yeah, thanks for it. So I added my water, and you know that sugar is going to dissolve whether I stir it or not. But you want to get used to stirring during this process. Stirring is your friend, and it is what is going to help activate the yeast. It's aerating, it's giving them oxygen, it's creating the ideal environment for them to thrive and start breaking down those sugars, and it's preventing any mold growth on the surface. So once you have your mixture here, put a cloth on top, maybe secure it with a rubber band if you have, animals or fruit flies that may get in there if you don't put it in snug. And then what you're going to be doing is leave it on the counter, keep it out of the sunlight, which could, if you have UV rays hitting it, could inhibit the fermentation process. And then you're going to want to stir it 2 to 3 times a day, 30 to 60 seconds. And again, you're pushing down that plant material, you're preventing mold growth, and you're aerating it. You're getting the yeast active.
Sorry, when you say cover it, would like, if we have a bowl with a plastic lid, is that sufficient, or does it need to have some airflow, like with a towel or?
Yeah, any lid will work. It doesn't need airflow. Sometimes I do it in quart-sized jars like this. It just needs to be aerated. So that's where the stirring comes in. Now, the next stage is, it really varies depending on the temperature, depending on the climate that you're in, maybe depending on like how much you bake in your kitchen, how many yeast are just there and around and ready to eat whatever sugar's around. And you're essentially waiting until you see and hear bubbles. Now, luckily, I have some examples of what that would look like. Let me see if my other camera works now. My phone is cool. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so it's not the best angle, but I just want to show you this, the bubbles that I have here, and you might be able to hear it through my computer. This has been going for a few days. You see the bubbles rising there? I'm going to see if you can also hear it. It's very subtle, so honestly, I can barely hear it. It's probably not going to work. But what you're going to do is you're going to use your senses, your sight, your hearing, in order to experience the liveliness of the beverage. So this is a blueberry chamomile flower soda, and I started this 3 days ago. And it's nice and bubbly. Sometimes it takes up to 5 days, especially in the winter for me. And things tend to break down more slowly. Now, last summer I had some that were nice and bubbly in 24 hours. So again, it depends what's going on, how active the yeast are, what your environment's like. I've got another one here. Let's see if that will show some more bubbles. You can see like the fizz kind of at the top there. Sometimes it's going to look a lot more active. I did stir these a couple hours ago, and it was a lot more clear to me. This one is, I called this one, oh, I wrote it down somewhere. I think I called it Mango Pittsburgh. So it has mango pit and peels, and then all the other ingredients are ingredients that I can find in my local landscape. So there are white pine needles in here. If anyone's familiar with spice bush, they're spice bush berries, and they taste like peppercorn mixed with allspice. They're really nice, and it's, it tastes like a spice. And then I use maple syrup. So the mango is kind of like the odd one out, and that it's not representing Pittsburgh, but I had this pit, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to use the mango pit to just flavor this, and the skins. And the yeast is coming from all of those raw ingredients, including, the pine needles, the spice bush. So those are some of the little side projects I have going on. I'll talk more about those too. But you saw those bubbles, and you want to experience those. You want to make sure that that you see that liveliness. And if you're not seeing anything, then you just keep stirring. So you're stirring, again, 2 to 3 times a day until you experience those bubbles. And then once you get to that point, you're straining it off into your carbonation vessel. Now, there are many different carbonation vessels you can use. Before I go into carbonation though, any questions about what I've done so far?
Would you be able to use any frozen fruits, or does that destroy the natural yeast?
Yeah, I actually used some frozen fruit. Actually, my blueberries were frozen. My chamomile flowers were fresh, so I was getting yeast from that too. But yeah, I've done wild ferments with frozen fruit before. They're really just going dormant. And yeah, you can still access those fruit. They might, small amounts could die off in some way, but really they're just being preserved and they're just hungry and waiting till they come back to room temperature and start to break down some sugar.
Now you had mentioned that like sometimes you get moldy fruit from work. Do you have to make sure that no mold gets into what you're doing?
Yeah, so again, the purpose of the stirring is to reduce mold. If you're using moldy fruit, I would definitely make sure that you're cutting off all that mold, that those mold spores aren't getting in there. You know, if I was using, let's say, a peach and like half of the peach was moldy, I might worry that the other side does have some of that mold on it that I can't really see yet. You know, you could take that risk. It just might mold more quickly. You might have to stir it more. If anyone has a mold allergy, I would definitely wouldn't do that. I would stay away from that. But yeah, I mean, you can use moldy fruit. I've probably seen my partner eat too many like moldy berries because she loves them so much, and like she's just not looking, and you know, you have the berries at the bottom of your container. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend eating or using those, but you could use like small pieces that are part of that same fruit. Cool. All right.
I'm curious if there's other pits. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I know in the chat, and you had talked about mango pit. Like, are there other pits or like things that we would normally like compost or throw out that you would recommend, like avocado pits or anything like that?
I haven't done anything with avocado pits as far as, well, I haven't done anything with avocado pits. I know you can do stuff as far as like grinding them down. Let's see. I wouldn't use, like, I didn't put my my peach pit in there. It's not really adding anything, and might be pulling out flavors you don't want. Let's see. I mean, for the apples, I could put the seeds in there because that doesn't really matter to me. Trying to think of other other pits.
No worries. I have none in mind. I was just curious.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like if I was doing like watermelon, if you leave the seeds in there, that'd probably be fine. I think eventually, if you're using like lots of seeds, it's gonna start pulling. Like if I had tons of apple seeds in there, you might start to get some of that flavor. But I mean, I encourage exploring different ways. So this is a side tangent, but where I went to school, they partnered with a local distillery to try to make a pawpaw whiskey. And what they didn't know is that the pawpaw pits are toxic before putting like thousands of dollars worth of pawpaws into their whiskey, which was really stupid. But yeah, before you do any big project like that, you know, look into it and make sure you know what you're doing, especially if it's like a new fruit. Yeah, I don't know. Soiree, do you have any thoughts on other pits that you would ferment or utilize? Seeds?
Pomegranate. I went to the kitchen, so I missed it. I'm all about using particularly, I bet you already said mango pit, you mentioned that. I mean, mango pit's one of my favorite. Then of course pomegranate seeds. Mm-hmm. But I use just about every, at home scale, I use just about if I can get my hands on it, if I think there's, scrape your mouth and it tastes wonderful, or you can smell it, I'll toss it in.
Mm. Cool. Yeah. No, you broke up a little bit, but I think I got what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, you have to do your investigation before you like scale it up.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Cool. All right. So here we go. So once this is nice and bubbly, then we go to the carbonation step. Now I'm going to use some of the active sodas that I had that I made a few days ago. I'm really excited for this blueberry chamomile one. I tasted it and it's so delicious. I got these fresh chamomile flowers and these frozen blueberries from last year that's from Pittsburgh. Now I'm going to get a strainer and a funnel and carbonation vessels. Plastic bottles, well, you want to avoid plastic most times in your life. They are your friend, especially in the beginning stages of getting used to carbonation, because you can feel them, you can experience that pressure physically, and you just can tell when it's carbonated. Most people are familiar with what a carbonated plastic bottle feels like, what kind of pressure and resistance you feel, and that's what you want to go for when you're gauging carbonation. These swing top bottles also work well. Make sure you're getting food grade ones. They have a lot of like ornamental ones out there that have thin glass, and they might not hold the pressure the same way. They can shatter easily. But these are made for holding pressure too. The downside is you can't gauge that carbonation in the same way with plastic. One way of reducing plastic but still using plastic to gauge this, let's say you're doing a gallon batch, you put 1 liter in your plastic bottle, and then you put the rest in this, in your swing top. So then you can just gauge it with your 1 plastic bottle. I use these Trader Joe's sparkling water bottles. Every now and then we'll pick some up from Trader Joe's, and I find that they're so perfect. But really, like, any plastic bottle will work. And then you can just reuse it for a while, and that can be your main source of gauging that carbonation. So I'm going to strain it off right into my bottle.
And sorry, how long had this one been sitting before you did this step?
This one was, it's funny, I usually write the date, but I didn't on this one. I'm pretty sure it's 3 or 4 days. Now, because I had so much plant material, fruit in here, obviously I'm not going to get a complete quart of liquid coming out of here. So this is kind of a different approach of taking it. What I showed you, where you add a quart of water, that's to get precisely the exact amount of liquid that you would want to come out of it to fill a bottle. And you do want to fill your bottle. It carbonates better. It gets less funky. It might take longer to carbonate if you have, less liquid than going up to the top. So, like right now, I'm almost 3/4 of the way. I'm just going to strain out some more of this. But because the flavor is actually pretty potent, it's to the point where I can dilute it with water, and it's not going to take away the flavor too much. Luckily, I added like a decent amount of blueberries and chamomile. But that's something to keep in mind. I was running low on half-gallon jars, and that's the most ideal for doing quart-sized batches for, fruit-based sodas, because the fruit takes up a decent amount of space. But I have done a lot of batches in these quart jars, and then I just end up having to dilute my bottle a little bit. So I think about trying to make more of a concentrate of flavor. That way when I dilute it, it doesn't take away that flavor. All right, so here we are. Now, before I even add some water, I'm actually first going to taste it. And this is an important step throughout the process. So I actually did, let's see. I did half a pound of blueberries, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and 2 tablespoons of maple. So I'm expecting this to be like pretty sweet. And it is, like if I just drank this, I would say like that's a little too sweet for me. That's a lot of sugar. You have a decent amount of sugar coming from the blueberries. I did a 1/4 cup, which is higher on the end as far as the ratio that I like to use, that 3 to 4 tablespoons. So when I dilute it, I know that it's gonna dilute that sugar, and it's probably gonna be pretty close to where I want it. Now I'm gonna leave a little bit of space just in case I feel like I need to top it off with a little bit of sugar if I diluted it too much. And this is where like the ratio is helpful, but it's really your own palate that's gonna tell you what you want. I got some chamomile petals just floating on there. It's a nice little garnish when you pour it out. Now I'm just gonna taste it to make sure it's at the right sweetness level for me. I think it's perfect. So, you know, you want to fill it up to the point where your bottle's getting thinner. And that's to create the ideal carbonation. And when you taste it before it goes in the bottle, you want it to be to the point where it's like just a tad too sweet for you, because when it's carbonating, it's going to sit at room temperature. Those yeasts are going to continue to digest that sugar, and therefore it's going to be actually less sweet when you pour it out in the end. So sometimes it's hard to find that sweet spot. Everyone has a different sweet tolerance, and it can take a little while to figure that out, but just taste it along the way. When you strain it out into your carbonation vessel, taste it. If you have to dilute it more, try to think about like how much more sugar you would need or how much you want to dilute it. If it's, say I have this much and it's still like really sweet, I would just pour a little bit out and then top it off with water just to dilute it to that ideal sugar content. All right, any questions about that so far? This is like, these are the basic steps for creating the carbonation. This usually takes, again, depending on your environment, anywhere from like 12 to 36 hours. Sometimes it can take longer, especially in the winter. Your yeast is consuming much more slowly. And you're gonna wait till you feel that pressure. Once you do, once it feels like there's carbonation in there, you throw it in the fridge, and then you wait until it's cool, and then you can drink it. Ideally, if you let it sit for like 12 hours, the carbonation can settle better. I don't know exactly what's happening, but you know, I've found that it just seems to, I don't know, like hold the carbonation better. If you are using swing tops, let's say you don't have plastic bottles, you're using some sort of glass, you can throw in some raisins, and they will actually float when it's carbonated. However, every raisin is different. I've had raisins that float up way too early, and I'm like, ooh, I'm excited, I'm gonna open it up, and there's no fizz. So it can be a fun way of like potentially gauging carbonation when you see those floating raisins, but it doesn't always do the trick. The swing tops are also great because you can just like lightly open it and just see if you hear that fizz. And usually you can, at least over time, gauge like, okay, if I hear that much fizz when I barely open it, it's definitely carbonated, and then you put it in the fridge. So that, there are tricks. And as you do this more, you just get the hang of it. You kind of use your intuition, and you just get the sense of, like, especially in the summer, it's going to take less than 24 hours to carbonate in my kitchen. So you're just kind of developing this knowledge in how these yeast are activating and are being active within these liquids. And then once you put it in the fridge, you pull it out and then you drink it. If for some reason you're like, wow, this actually isn't that great, I've found that a lot of my like very experimental batches turn into being like cocktail mixers or used for something else. I tried to do like a beet, carrot, and turmeric soda. And it wasn't very active. It didn't pick up the carbonation. It was kind of just weird. It sounds weird, but I just decided to reduce it, and I turned it into, over time, like a barbecue sauce. I just reduced it until it became this kind of paste. So, you can be clever with what you have that's left over. You can start adding it to different things. You could, put a small amount in a salad dressing or, whatever it is. Just know that if it doesn't taste ideal to you, doesn't mean that you can't use it for something else. Don't immediately compost it or pour it down the drain. Shelf life in the fridge. Does the carbonation carbonation stage slow down or stop? So in the fridge, it can last a very long time. I've never had any moldy carbonated beverages that sit in the fridge. It's going to slowly ferment over time, so it doesn't completely stop the fermentation. In fact, sometimes I've found that if I throw it in the fridge and it wasn't at the ideal carbonation stage, eventually it can get there in the fridge alone. I like to think about trying to drink mine within roughly 2 weeks. It can start to get funky over time. We're talking about wild yeast, so the difference between doing this or like making kombucha or tibikos, aka water kefir, is that it's kind of a wild card. No pun intended. You're actually, using these microscopic creatures that you don't really know, as opposed to a SCOBY coming from kombucha. You know generally what you're gonna get. So sometimes you might get more bacteria. You might get more acidity coming out of it. Luckily, the great thing about this compared to doing wild fermented alcohol is that you're not fermenting it to the point where you're getting that much acid out of it. Unless you're letting it sit and you're stirring it for a long time on the counter and it's been active for a while, eventually it could start turning to vinegar. But I've never really gotten to that stage because usually it's pretty clear when it's active. So, you could get some funky flavors over time, especially if it's been sitting in the fridge for like a month or so. And you might get some unique aromas, but that's really all that's happening. It's still safe, and it can still be delicious. If not, sometimes they age better in the fridge too. Concerned about slow fridge bombs. Yeah, so you don't have to worry about fridge bombs if you're using the plastic, sadly. I haven't had any flip-top bottles explode on me, but I also had like one really intense explosion when I started getting into fermentation, and that was like in the heat of a Wisconsin winter where we didn't have AC, and I didn't know what I was doing, and that was a gallon-sized jar, and it blew up at 4 a.m. And that's like a whole story, but it really frightens you during that experience to the point where you're like, okay, I'm going to be safe with this. So yeah. Yeah, so bottling beer, you might experience something similar. But yeah, in the beginning, plastic is your friend. And then, I recommend trying flip-top bottles or trying them side by side. So I showed you one process of doing this, and that was kind of that single batch. We poured all the liquid that we need in with the fruit, in with the herbs, and then we just stir it. And then we know exactly how much liquid we're coming out of. You can also try to harvest wild yeast by going outside and picking some flowers, or even just using a small amount of fruit and using, oh, this is a glass, but like a half-pint jar. Use a very small jar, and you can throw in some sugar, throw in your flowers or your, one berry, or even for those who've seen like raspberry stalks, you see that bloom on there, that's wild yeast. You could throw that in there, and you could just harvest that wild yeast, and that could be your starter. So if I took my mash and chopped up apples, lemon balm, pour in that quart of water, and if I had a yeast starter that I made from the flowers or the berries or the raspberry stalk, I can just inoculate it with that, and that would be the starter. So in that case, I have the starter already made on the side, and then I have that quart batch of liquid that may have been sitting to macerate and extract flavors, and then I would just strain them out and put them right into my carbonation vessel after adding that yeast. Or you could add the yeast even before that, but really you're harvesting that wild yeast in order to inoculate it, and you don't have to utilize specifically like the yeast that are coming from the apples or the lemon balm or what have you. So that's one way of going about it. Let's say you have some red raspberry in your backyard and you see that bloom and you're just curious, you want to harvest that yeast. Just take a little bit of water, throw in a couple tablespoons of sugar, throw in that stem, and then just shake it. Do the same process as you would for the wild fermented soda. Just shake it daily, or stir it, and do that until it's bubbly, and then it's active. So that'll be another approach to this same process. I generally just do that single batch. Sometimes I won't even measure the quart of liquid. I'm just throwing a bunch of stuff in a bowl. I throw in the sugar. Maybe I'm measuring the sugar if I know how much I'm making. But sometimes I just eyeball everything, and then I really just do it to taste. And then once I'm carbonating it, that's when I make sure that I'm getting the right amount, that I'm filling up my carbonation vessel. So once you know this basic process, you can really play around with it. Again, you could do this on the fly where you're coming home from work or you're about to go to work and you're just throwing it together very quickly, and then you just stir it throughout the next few days or until it's bubbly. And then you can taste it and just make sure that you're getting those ideal flavors. Any questions about those different processes? They're essentially the same process, just adding different volumes of liquid and doing different batches. If not, I'll show you some other things that I have going on here.
I have a quick question on like the wild yeast.
Yeah.
So we're beekeepers, and we have what you would call like baker's honey, where the water content is a little bit too high to keep it in a jar without it, kind of fermenting on its own a little bit.
Right.
I would assume that you would call that wild yeast that's in there with the honey and the water. Do you have any experience with that at all? Have you used it, anything like that? Because we have a bunch of it, and we're kind of curious, what we could.
Yeah, so raw honey is a great yeast source, and Soare actually touched on making simple mead in her workshop, and it was using raw honey as the yeast source. And you could do the same thing with making soda. So you could add 3 to 4 tablespoons of honey, add some water, and you stir it daily. And because there are yeast in the honey, you'd eventually get that bubbly, and you could just make it like a honey soda. It might not have that much flavor, but it would be a fun, bubbly honey concoction. And yeah, I mean, you're utilizing the yeast that are coming from like all around the landscape, right? You're essentially, the bees are harvesting and bringing you the yeast. And it's pretty beautiful. I actually, one day would love to keep bees, but yeah, I mean, that would be the basic process. And I would say, go for it. Use your raw honey or, whatever you have from your bees and turn it into soda or, wine if you'd like.
Yeah, we've got, 80,000 to 100,000 foragers out there and, from a hive, touching every flower in 2 or 3 mile radius. So, okay. Yeah. if you had any insight on that, that's great. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, sure. Any other questions? I'll show you a few other things I have here. I'm gonna see if I can bring back my overview. All right, so this next one that I made, I called this Zest Fest 2021. It's one lemon that's been squeezed with some lemon peel, some clementine with the peel that I squeezed, hibiscus, hops, and maple syrup. So as you can see, there's that raft floating on top. And that's like one clear sign that it's probably going to be pretty bubbly when I stir it, when everything's just floating there and it's kind of pushing up a little bit. And so even before I stir it, I know, like I can see that it's active, but I also see that pressure from below, that carbonation that's already there. And so, you know, I just push down and the bubbles are raising to the top. You can maybe hear it. I don't know if you can hear that. It's very, yeah, very subtle, but it's there and it smells delicious. It smells like, honestly, it smells like something I'd want to bathe in. I feel like these are all like very healing properties. The lemon, the hibiscus, the hops. And these are all things I just had around. I had dried hops from last year. The lemons were just from my fridge. The clementine was looking very sad. It wanted to be used. Hibiscus petals, flower petals were harvested from last year. And it's this beautiful pink from that hibiscus. And it's ready, so I'm just gonna strain it out into my carbonation vessel. And then it would be good to go. So I wanted to make all these different examples of what you could do so you would feel inspired to really use what you have around you. Whether that's in your fridge, whether that's something that's like near rotting somewhere in your kitchen, or that's like really trying to reflect the local landscape and trying to forage or harvest what's around you. In the winter, there isn't a whole lot, especially in Pittsburgh. Anyone in the Northeast, you can't really get much from your farmers. And what I've started to do is try to find what I can gather from the trees on my landscape. So I experimented a lot with different types of pine needles this past winter. I did a Eastern white pine soda. I did a red pine. I did Eastern hemlock. And I just did very simple cold infusions and I just compared them. And I was able to like taste the differences between these pines that are, you know, all generally in the same family, but emit different flavors, you know? The white pine, like I had other people taste some of these and people would say like, oh, this tastes like a taxi. And like, sometimes that was a good way. Other people were like, yeah, this tastes too much like a car air freshener. Another one tastes just the red pine. I think it tasted just like a Christmas tree. So I just wanted to emanate, you know, the different flavors you can get from your landscape, even when you think that you can't really find anything. For those of you who are, you know, connected with the seasons by either farming, growing something, foraging, trying to identify what's edible around you, I encourage you to go outside and even just within, you know, 100 square feet of your house and see what you can identify, what you can pick, and what you can, you know, infuse into a soda. Even if if you grow some herbs, fresh rosemary, lavender, all of those would be really delicious in a soda. And you can simply just, you know, throw them in there, chop up the herb, whatever, and try to extract those. Now, if you're trying to do a hot infusion, it could be as simple as making a tea, and then if you're using, let's say you're using a quart, you're doing a quart size batch, you make a quart of tea, let's say I'm making a red pine tea and I did a hot infusion, I let it steep for 20 minutes or so. I would just strain it out, and I actually found some red pine cones that had this bloom on them, these very tiny ones, and I threw them in there and I extracted the yeast from there. You could just, in that instance, you could throw in some apples, or you could throw in any fruit you have around you. So you have your tea and then you're just inoculating it with some other raw material that hasn't been cooked. Because once you pour over that hot water, you're killing all of those yeast. So in that sense, you could take any tea and inoculate it with wild yeast, as long as you have that raw material to introduce. You could do that, the wild yeast extraction on the side, like I was talking about with the raspberry stem, or you could just throw something directly into it. And then you just do the same process. You'd stir it daily until it gets bubbly and strain it off. So that would be an example of doing a hot infusion. Yeah, let's see. So your honey, that could be your source of yeast, but really all of your sugars are processed to the point where they do not contain yeast because they've been cooked in some form. I've done some interesting things with maple sap, like maple water. What is branded now as maple water at some stores. And it's gotten to the point where, like, I've noticed that if I'm just using maple water and like cane sugar, you can't really taste the maple from the maple water, from the maple sap. But it is a fun thing to play around with if you have any sort of sap around you and you're able to harvest that. You could use your maple sap and then add some maple syrup and try to get some maple flavor in there. But yeah, that was an interesting ferment. All right, this last one that I have here, this is another chamomile one. This is a larger batch. I'm gonna, again, spotlight my other video. And this one is similar to the other one, so it's not as crazy, but I used the chamomile flowers again, and I actually used some peaches that were frozen from last year as well. And you can see that there's like, I didn't even stir it yet, but you can see the bubbles. And this one's pretty loud. See if you can hear it there. So that is, like, I would say, the most exemplary version of what you could experience, and that it has the sound, you see the bubbles, it's pretty clear, you know it's ready. I believe this was 3 days. Yeah, 3 days. So I just want to give you those different examples, not only of different ingredients you can use, but what it would look like when it's carbonated and bubbly. And in that respect, because there is some carbonation, there's some bubbles in there, you could drink that as is. I mean, it's still going to be slightly effervescent. It's not going to have that same ideal carbonation as soda. But it can, still be delicious. Immediately can make a good, like, cocktail mixer. Any other questions? I'm pretty sure that's everything. I'll finish with some books you might want to check out if you're interested in all of this, but just want to make sure that I get any questions answered.
I just wanted to ask, like, go-to recipe for a cocktail, since you had mentioned that. I'm sure it depends on the soda, but what do you usually like to pair? Like, what's close at hand for you?
Yeah, I'm a big gin fan, so let's see. For let's say this peach chamomile, I would taste it and see how much acidity is in there too. So I would do, like a shot of, I don't have any recipes for cocktails, so I'm just kind of spitballing this, but I would do like a shot of gin and then pour maybe like a cup and a half or something like that of the peach chamomile. And if it wasn't that acidic, I would add a little bit of lemon juice. And that would be great for me. I don't get very fancy. I usually have like 2 or 3 ingredients in cocktails, but I don't know if anyone else here is really into cocktails, please share.
Oh yeah, we're just looking for a mood, not a recipe. So I appreciate that. That's good.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Usually, like a lot of the sodas that I make, I would say are like more delicate to the point where if I was adding whiskey, I feel like it would overpower it. But you know, it really depends. Right now, gin would be my go-to, especially because of the kind of like the botanical flavor of gin. Whiskey with that peach chamomile, yeah, I mean that could work. Guess it depends who you are, right? Or
like
what kind of whiskey you're using. What's
Could
that?
you do like a basil gimlet, like a cucumber basil soda or something, or would cucumber not translate well to this?
Yeah. Excuse me. You could totally use cucumber. I don't know if I've done any specific cucumber sodas in that I was like relying on the cucumber for yeast. The thing is, like, cucumber doesn't have that much sugar, so you might have more like lactic acid bacteria than yeast. But you could get an interesting like lactic acid soda or lactic, bacteria fermented soda. I'm glad you mentioned basil because I also had some basil that I meant to put in my soda. And so you could, let's say you wanted to do a cucumber basil soda, you could just rely on the basil for your yeast, especially like if you have a lot of basil flowers. Basil flowers would be great if you're just trying to pick them off to make sure your basil doesn't bolt, and use those for their wild yeast. Again, like if you're using properties that don't have a lot of yeast, it's possible you could get more bacteria in there. Or if you're using ingredients that don't have a lot of sugar on them. But sometimes, as I mentioned, I feel like red raspberry stems are like the perfect example where you can actually see that bloom. You can walk around in nature and sometimes find that on other things. Pine cones are great for that too, especially when they're young, like early spring pine cones. Do you deal with wax on fruit before ferment? Can you tell me what you mean by that? Like wax that is been put on?
So like somebody mentioned cucumbers and it made me think of all the food grade wax that's on the peels.
Right.
So I was thinking, like, do you have any effort, scrubbing lemons, scrubbing clementines, scrubbing cucumbers, or peeling them and discarding them? Kind of what do you do?
That's a good question. So I don't really do anything with them. I mean, as far as, I guess the first question is like, do you want to put it in your body? And then if the answer is, yeah, that's fine, then I would say like, well, can you get wild yeast from it? And in all of these cases, my experience is yes, to the point where like, even if you're getting a very conventional apple that has been sprayed, let's say it's covered in insecticide and fungicide when you get it, there's still some active yeast on there. While you might not want to put that in your body, that's a whole other thing. But if you're just trying to harvest the wild yeast, there is something there. I would say like ginger is an example where if you're getting ginger that isn't organic, it could be radiated. So it's essentially, dead. Like people who try to make ginger bugs, if anyone's familiar with a ginger bug, it's just a starter eating ginger and water. If you don't use organic ginger, it might not take because it doesn't have any wild yeast on it. So yeah, I don't really do anything specifically for wax, but I also, honestly, like when I'm doing this, especially if I'm doing larger batches, I'm trying to use fruit that I'm either getting from my local farmer and I know how it's been treated, or that I'm foraging myself. And then kind of on the side, I just use what I can get from the grocery store, something that's rotting or what I get for free at work.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering if like there anything that prevents the yeast from taking hold. I was thinking of salt or vinegar or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, a certain amount of vinegar could, but I think you would need a decent amount. Alcohol could, depending on how much alcohol you're using. Though, water could, if you have a lot of chlorine, that could inhibit the fermentation. I have made some some sodas where I'll add an oxymel at the end. And oxymel is just a vinegar and honey herbal extraction. So I think it was a white pine oxymel. So it was a concentrated vinegary, like honey solution. And I just added that after I inoculated my batch. So when I strained everything into my carbonation vessel, I added a little bit of that vinegar honey solution, and it fermented well and it had really good flavor. So in small amounts, I would encourage experimenting with that. I think when it gets to the point where it's so acidic you don't want to drink it because it tastes so much like vinegar, then that's probably the point where it might kill the yeast, or it might prevent them from being very active. And same thing with alcohol. I mean, a lot of wild yeast can't tolerate alcohol levels more than like 4 or 5%. So if you're trying to make some sort of like carbonated cocktail of some sort, keep that in mind. I haven't really experimented with that, but yeah, it's something to keep in mind. Vinegar, alcohol, water, and then really just not having any like source of wild yeast are probably the main inhibitors for that like bubbly active state. Any other questions? All right, we are at time, but I just want to highlight 2 books here. If you're interested in kind of these weird, funky, fascinating, like wildcrafted foraging bubbly concoctions, The Wildcrafted Brewer by Pascal Baudard, highly recommend it. He is based out in California, so a lot of what he does talk about might not relate to you specifically when he's talking about specific plants, but all the processes are going to be the same. And it's very inspiring because his approach sometimes is, bring a jar with you when you go on a hike in the woods and then just see what you find, throw some bark in there, throw essentially whatever is edible on your hike, and then turn that into a carbonated beverage that represents your local landscape. Or, you could call it your midsummer hike soda, or you call it whatever trail you're on if you want to. But I think he really lays out the basics of all this, different ways of approaching it. And, the subtitle here says primitive beers, country wines, herbal meads, natural sodas, and more. So he really covers a lot of ground. And then also just for like history and cultural context and some inspiring recipes, Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers is a great one. And it just makes you think about like what people have actually been using for hundreds, if not thousands of years to make lightly alcoholic beverages, from like mugwort to stinging nettle and, all these different herbs and plants you can find on your landscape. And then of course, Sander Katz, if you're just looking to get more into fermentation broadly, the art of fermentation, wild fermentation. Yeah, he's written some of the best books as far as just diving into it and trying to understand it all from a cultural and recipe standpoint. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thank you all so much for being part of this. I enjoy having small groups, so I appreciate all of you for participating too. And this is the grand finale of an 8-part series, so I'm really happy that it's over, but also that people were enthusiastic about it, and hopefully you feel inspired to make some sodas at home. Feel free to reach out to me via email. All of you should have my email, Instagram, check out my website. And yeah, I hope to see you soon, and feel free to tag us if you're fermenting stuff on Instagram or Facebook.
Thanks so much. This is awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
You're
Very
welcome.
fun. Have a good night.
Happy fermenting.